Good afternoon and welcome to Remaking the Economy in the Black Belt. I'm Steve Dubb and I'm Senior Editor here at Nonprofit Quarterly. Today we'll be discussing how community organizations are supporting development in the Black Belt and the Mississippi Delta. For this conversation, we will have three distinguished guests who will share their experience and knowledge. Cornelius Blanding is Executive Director of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives and Land Assistance Fund, a network of cooperatives in the Black Belt founded in 1967. Bill Bynum is founder and CEO of Hope, a leading Southern community development financial institution based in Jackson, Mississippi with a multi-state region. Leonette Henderson is Director of Development and Partnerships at Higher Purpose Company, a nonprofit that builds community wealth with Black residents across Mississippi. We will also be showing a video interview I had with Dr. Shirley Sherrod. Dr. Sherrod founded the nation's first community land trust called New Communities near Albany, Georgia, which celebrated its 50th anniversary last fall. A few notes before we get started. First, we're very excited to take your questions, and we will be leaving time at the end of the webinar for panelists to answer them, so please put them in the question box. And I will share them with the panelists when we get to that part of today's webinar. Second, we will be sharing the slides and recording with everyone via email after the webinar. We'll email them out and we will also post them on the MPQ webpage by Monday at the latest, so don't worry. And finally, we're very happy to offer this webinar free of charge to our community. But of course, these webinars are not free. You may recall we had a $7,500 matching grant from the John R. O'Shea Foundation in Buffalo, and I'm pleased to say that we've met that match, so thanks to all of you who helped us do that. Of course, while the match is over, your donations are always welcome, so if you haven't given already, please consider supporting NPQ today. You can also support the work by joining the conversation on social media. Our hashtag is hashtag rebuild the economy. Share your comments and questions. We'd love to hear them. Thanks again for being with us today. And again, after the webinar, we'll be having a brief survey. So please keep a lookout for that window after our conversation. And now I'll give I'll do a short presentation to frame today's discussion. Okay. Why have a series on remaking the economy? Just to identify, this is part of a larger series that we've been running for 2 years. And some basic principles behind this is to build awareness in the field, identify examples, question narratives about the economy, highlight pathways for change, and emphasize links between the different movements and groups. Next slide, please. All right, so where is the Black Belt? So there's the Black Belt actually has multiple definitions, and we may get to this in the questions and answers a bit. In terms of the land and the soil, it often refers to the Black Belt region of Alabama specifically. There's also a broader definition that looks at where African Americans primarily live within the United States, and that's obviously much broader, going with the large percentage living in that region from Louisiana through Virginia. And it's important to note that there's growing political clout in the Black Belt. We've seen this in statewide elections in places like Georgia and Florida, and of course in Alabama. If you look at that map, there's not a legend, but I think you can figure out that the blue regions refer to votes for Democrat Doug Jones. Red regions refer to votes for Republican Roy Moore, and you can see that if you were to toggle back to the previous slide, you would see that the dark blue region is in fact the Black Belt. So very much a correlation there between the two maps. Next slide. So today, the organizations we're going to be hearing from: Federation of Southern Cooperatives, been around about over 50 years. Hope, been around, I believe, at least 25 years. And Higher Purpose, a newer organization that works on building community wealth with Black entrepreneurs in Mississippi. And this is part of a general series. Next up on our series will be Buffalo, New York. Really excited to share with you some examples involving community land trusts, comprehensive development, and we'll also be speaking with the head of the county commission there. So please join us in a month. And with that, I'm going to end my presentation and broadcast of the interview I did with Dr. Sherrod. I'm Steve Dubb, Senior Editor with Nonprofit Quarterly. I'm here with Dr. Shirley Sherrod, longtime civil rights activist and co-founder of New Communities, Inc., the first community land trust in the United States. Shirley, welcome to Nonprofit Quarterly.
Thank you.
I wanted to begin just by giving you a chance to talk a little bit more about your background.
Well, I grew up on a farm in South Georgia with no intention of actually letting that be part of my longtime life and work. I wanted to get as far away from the South as I could, but my father was murdered in March of 1965, and on the night of his death, I made a commitment to stay in the South to work for change. And he was murdered by a white farmer who was not prosecuted because the all-white grand jury refused to indict him, even though there were witnesses.
Great, thanks. For those who aren't familiar with the Black Belt, how would you go about describing it?
Well, I normally describe it as that area where the largest number of Black people live, and that started somewhere up in the North Carolina area, and you can just see on a map that shows from earlier years even till today that a large number of Black people lived in certain areas in those states going all the way over to Alabama and Mississippi.
Great, thanks. So could you talk about a little bit about the story behind New Communities?
Well, you know, when there is a need and you live among the people and you're a part of them, you, with their help, you try to develop solutions to it. That's kind of what happened with New Communities. We were helping people to access their rights, you know, the right to vote, the right to have their kids enter grade schools and so forth. And the problem was presented because people would be kicked off the land owned by white farmers, and we had to develop a solution for that. And that solution was to try to create a community for them. And we decided that back then, once we were getting our hands on some land, we didn't ever want to lose it again. And therefore, after a trip to Israel where we looked at how they were resettling their people, we used that information and information we had to develop what we felt was a system that would keep the land in our hands forever and ever. Now, we were not successful at keeping that piece of property, which was about 6,000 acres. And that was because of the discrimination that we continued to experience. They would do things like dilute our fertilizer, wouldn't give us the correct price or the right money for products we were producing. They would always grade them lower, for example, with peanuts, so that we wouldn't get what we should have gotten. So we faced all kinds of opposition just in trying to hold on to the land that we had.
Great. Shirley, Mike, could you talk a little bit too about the Pigford case and your involvement in that case?
Yes, so once we lost our land in 1985, we lost everything, all of the land that we had, which was about 6,000 acres. And the new owner, Farmers Home Administration, let him buy it at a fifth of what it was worth. It was worth about $5 million, all of our assets, but they let him borrow. They let him get it for $1 million and then let him borrow $950,000 while not offering the service and options they should have given to us. But so I started working then with the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, helping farmers initially in Southwest Georgia and then throughout the state of Georgia and eventually throughout the South with the Federation. And no matter how many programs we tried to develop to help our farmers, the biggest problem was access to credit, and the discrimination, the largest amount of discrimination was coming out of USDA. Pigford was filed in 1997. The government agreed to settle. So in 1999, farmers had 6 months to submit a claim in the Pigford case. And for me, I was so busy. We were all out in Texas and Alabama and Georgia and other states trying to make sure farmers learned about the Pigford case, make sure they had help with gathering the information they needed to present to a lawyer for their case. So I was busy doing that, and 3 months had gone by when one night I was driving from Alabama, and the light bulb went off. We, New Communities, our land trust, actually qualified to file a claim in Pigford. But I was so busy helping others, I almost forgot it.
Yeah, talk about how you pursued your claim and, the new communities, I guess, that's been established.
Yeah. So with Pigford, there were two classes, A and B. And many of our farmers, were with an A claim, as an A claimant, they would get $50,000. They would get $12,500 paid as taxes on the 50. They would get priority for going, moving forward for USDA programs. In other words, they would get debt written off, but they were not. You couldn't look for this to totally set a farmer straight. With the B claims, you had a lot more information, and there was no limit. The amount of the claim was limited only to what could be proven in court. So with New Communities, with 6,000 acres and the loss there, of course, New Communities, with the economists testifying and so forth, could actually qualify for more than the 50. And I think in the end, New Communities received the largest payout in Pigford. But it was a long battle. New Communities signed before the deadline of October 13, 1999, had its day in court on July the 30th, 2002, and didn't hear about whether we had been successful or not until July the 8th, 2009, almost a total of 10 years later. And that was a tough battle.
Great, thanks. There's a legacy of trauma stemming both from slavery and continued racial discrimination. What do you find to be effective ways to address trauma and build the readiness of the community to engage in economic development, like the Land Trust?
We have a long, long history of trying to survive through slavery, through Jim Crow, through all that USDA could throw at us in terms of not treating us right, even though we were landowners and farmers through the years. So you have to keep people motivated to keeping their eyes on the prize, and having their eyes on the prize is, continuing to own land, continuing to be able to farm, continuing to be able to build businesses from the assets they've been able to acquire. It wasn't because they got a lot of help with doing it. It's because people were working together, looking toward the future and what was needed to continue to build, to continue to try to survive.
What do you see as some of the most transformative strategies being implemented in the Black Belt today?
Well, the fact that we used cooperatives to try and still use that method to try to build. I told farmers early on when I started organizing and working first with New Communities and later with the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, there is no way individual farmers can make it out there in this atmosphere today. They have to band together. For example, the farmers market located in Thomasville, Georgia, which was a state farmers market, and white farmers and white buyers locked them out of their system. So then you have to try to figure out how you can work together to get into other markets. So we've had to look outside to try to build what we need to keep being able to actually try to increase the income from the farm. You can't, these guys with 50 acres, 100 acres can't make it growing peanuts, cotton, corn. That bigger guys have the market set on that, and there's only so much they can make. So trying to work together to figure out what else can be done and work together to build those facilities and secure those markets is part of what we've done. And you can do that working cooperatively. I use that same thing in organizing communities. I can give you an example. In Baker County, my home county, they've saved an old school, and there's a USDA certified commercial kitchen there. And then there's another group organized in that same county that's they call themselves the Community Council. They meet every Monday night. They monitor every public meeting that's being held with the city commission, the county commission, the board of registrars. They've been able to stop the board of registrars from actually closing four of the 5 voting precincts located in that county. And it's only through working together. And they realize they have to work together to fight some of the things that are happening today.
Great, thanks. Is there anything else that you would like to add?
You can't stop. You can't let things that happen to you sometime on a daily basis keep you from keeping your eyes on the prize. And I love to win. So I'll put years into trying to win, as you see, and trying to build. I have a love for this work. I have a love for the people, and it makes it easier to try to keep fighting.
Great. Shirley Sherrod, thanks so much for being here with us at Nonprofit Quarterly.
Thank you.
And now we'll go back to the webinar. And first up will be Cornelius Blanding. Cornelius.
Yes. Well, good afternoon. I'm Cornelius Blanding with the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund. The Federation is a nonprofit cooperative association of Black farmers, landowners, and cooperatives all around the South. We were founded directly out of the Civil Rights Movement in 1967, organized more than 75 cooperatives, credit unions, and community-based groups all around the South, particularly about 9 states. And there was exactly those 9 states that was on the slide that you saw earlier around the Black Belt South. Next slide. The history of the organization, again, we were formed directly out of the Civil Rights Movement by 22 co-ops. But in 1966, prior to the founding of the Federation, there were about 10 co-ops that came together. And these 10 co-ops were a subset of many co-ops that had been formed all around the South prior to the Civil Rights Movement. And they were formed directly out of necessity. But 10 of those co-ops came together in 1966 to discuss the idea of a federation. And in 1967, they formed the federation. But again, necessity is the key point here. You had women in Alabama who were losing their jobs and being kicked off their land because they were registering to vote. They formed quilting bees. You had farmers in Tennessee who couldn't get access to gas just to run their farms, a basic necessity. They formed co-ops to go across state lines to buy gas in order to operate their farms. You had vegetable producers in Mississippi who couldn't get access to good pricing for their products, similar to Louisiana, where you had sweet potato growers who couldn't get a fair price. They formed cooperatives just to survive. It was a necessity back in the 60s. But anyway, 10 of those co-ops came together in 1966 to talk about an idea of a federation. And in 1967, they actually organized the Federation of Southern Cooperatives in Atlanta, Georgia. Their mission then and still now was strictly and simply to be a catalyst for the development of self-supporting communities through cooperative economic development, land retention, and advocacy. Next slide. And as part of that, the organization primarily focuses on 3 areas: cooperative economic development, land retention, and advocacy. And in terms of cooperative economic development, how do we organize cooperatives in the sense where they are a tool for self-help? How do we save Black-owned land? How do we make sure land is still a basis of our communities? And then looking at advocacy in terms of advocating for better programs and policies that support the mission of the organization, the work in these communities, and the overall facets of the organization itself. So for us, cooperative economic development is a simple tool. It's a tool to do self-help development. How do people form their own organizations, operate their own organizations in order to meet their basic needs, to meet many of those things that are necessities? And how do we make sure that land is maintained in our communities? How do we make sure that land that is threatened is saved, and make sure that it is used and developed in a way that it's a wealth generating tool? And again, being a part of the structure of the country in terms of all the policies and programs that are out there and advocating for better ones. Next slide. But at the end of the day, for us as an organization, there's the core challenge of our work, and a challenge statement is listed. There was, in 1910, there were 218,000 Black farmers owning roughly 15 million acres of land. And before the turn of the century, the land base had declined to 2.3 million acres, which in Black farmers dropped down from 218,000 to 18,000. So you see a significant loss of land in less than a century. And that's the basis of our work. That was the main challenge of our work. But it's the challenge statement that we embrace and that we work to make sure that we're always reversing this trend, and make sure that this statement, the statement that that a commission on civil rights was put together, and the statement they made was that if the land loss continued at the rate that it was going, they said before the turn of the century, there would be no Black-owned land. And that's a tremendous statement. That's an impactful statement that could be very detrimental to our community, but also very detrimental to this country. And so what our primary driving force was to make sure that that prediction that there will be no Black-owned land by the year 2000 if this rate of land loss continued at its rate, that there will be none. And our whole goal is to make sure that prediction didn't and doesn't come true. And so that forms the basis of our work. And again, it's coupled with cooperative development, where we're organizing co-ops as a tool, because once you save land, once you develop land, you have to make it productive. And so cooperative economic development is one form of that, but also making sure that we own a land base in the country, and there's an agricultural base in this country, so the country doesn't shift from agriculture to industrialization, but also being a part of the legislative part of the country in terms of advocating for better programs and policies. And so that's our organization in a nutshell. That's the work that we've done over the last 53 years and continue to do, but all under one mission in terms of being a catalyst for the development of self-supporting communities. And again, all around the vehicles of cooperative economic development, land retention, and advocacy. Thank you.
Thanks, Cornelius. And next up will be Bill Bynum from Hope. Bill, you have the floor.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks, everyone, for sharing, allowing us to share information about our work with you. To start with a little more context about the region that has been described earlier so well by Dr. Sherrod and by Cornelius. What you'll see here are two slides. The one on the left is a map that was created on the eve of the Civil War 160 years ago. It shows where the concentration of slaveholding was greatest in the United States. And you can see a lot of overlap between this map and the maps that were described earlier. The map on the right is a map that shows where poverty, the poverty rate has been over 20%, not for 30 years in a row, which is the federal definition of persistent poverty, but for a half a century of entrenched poverty. You see the deepest areas are across the Deep South and in other communities of color across the country, in Indian country, across the U.S.-Mexico border, and also in Appalachia. Poverty is not just a Black issue. It covers, it addresses, and limits the opportunity for a lot of people, but disproportionately it is in the South, and it does touch people of color. Hope was created to make sure that place, race, gender, and other things that are beyond people's control do not limit their ability to support their families and but we all know that the solutions to poverty and these challenges are multifaceted and complex. And at some point, whether it's jobs, whether it's housing, whether it's healthcare, it all requires access to capital. And so providing access to capital is the primary tool that HOPE uses to help make sure that where people are born, their race, their gender doesn't limit their opportunity. Next slide, please. Digging deeper into our part of the country, HOPE works in Mississippi, Arkansas, Alabama, Louisiana, and Tennessee. And our footprint, the place where we live and work, is home to 1/3 of all of the counties in the United States that were represented on that map, where poverty has been over 20% for a half a century. And as I was mentioning, we already talked about the disproportionate impact on people of color. You can see all these maps show where these conditions are more severe than they are in the U.S. overall, where we have the highest constant in every persistent poverty. Most of the persistent poverty counties in our region are majority Black. They also are the places where you have the highest levels of unemployment, where you need more jobs, where the housing conditions are the worst. You have the highest cost lending rates in the nation and in our region, where the education outcomes are the lowest. We've got significant disparities in terms of investments in schools and in low-income communities and communities of color, where the health outcomes are the lowest, and where you have the highest rates of people who are outside the banking system looking in. For a quarter century, HOPE, which is a nonprofit loan fund, HOPE Enterprise Corporation, HOPE Credit Unions, a $300 million credit union that is owned by women and by people of color. So much of this is built on the work that Cornelius and the Federation for Southern Co-ops have done for so long. We've collectively been making investments to ensure that families and children across the Deep South have the same opportunities that people in more affluent places have. And we've been able to plow $2.5 billion in financing in business and homes and community facilities that have benefited over 1.5 million people in some of the nation's most impoverished communities. In addition to the credit union and the Enterprise Corporation, the Hope Policy Institute takes data, both quantitative data and the stories from these communities and the people we serve, and use it to influence policies and practices of institutions, government, of policymakers, banks, corporations, to try to drive more investment and create ecosystem that is more supportive of people in poverty. The next slide, please. Since 2008, since the financial crisis, HOPE has expanded from 8 locations to 33 financial inclusion offices across the Deep South. Again, they are most of our locations are in majority Black counties. As you can see, 83% are in majority Black counties. Most of these are in persistent poverty counties, 75%. So we go where banks have closed in record numbers since the financial crisis, making sure that people have the tools that they need to climb the economic ladder. Next slide, please. One of the most compelling examples and great examples of HOPE's work is in Itta, Bena, Mississippi. Itta, Bena is the home of Mississippi Valley State University. It's also it's in a persistent poverty county. You can see the data here. The poverty rate in Itta, Bena, 42% compared to 14% U.S. overall. Education outcomes are lower. Household income much lower, 3 times. The U.S. is 3 times as high. High rates of people who are using payday lenders, check cashers, predatory lenders that should be, quite frankly, outlawed, and high concentrations of 92% of the residents that are Black. The woman on the right is Miss Penny Dodson. She, on her 100th birthday, made the first deposit ever in a financial institution when she made open an account at HOPE after we had taken over and converted a branch that had been closed by the bank Had never taken loan applications, was just cashing checks and taking deposits. And we were able to convert that into a branch. And Ms. Dodson said it was the first time she ever felt respected and welcomed enough to go into a depository and make a deposit. We have worked in Itta, Bena to take talk to the community, and they have helped us focus on where our investments could make the most difference in helping them to climb the economic ladder. Last slide, please. The next slide. Many of you will recognize this iconic photo. It's the march from Selma to Montgomery. Hope recently opened 2 branches in Montgomery. We're really excited about doing more work in the Black Belt. In 1964, Dr. King led this march, trying to secure voting rights, legal rights for residents across the region and across the country. This and so many other acts of courage were in so many moments collectively became a movement that changed conditions that for many thought were impossible to change. And when Dr. King died in Memphis, he was working to shift the movement's focus from voting rights to economic opportunity. Every unbanked person who opens an account at Hope or escapes a debt trap, every woman, business, or entrepreneur of color who gets the loan and helps create wealth, every first-time home buyer who gets that primary source of assets that so many Americans, unfortunately, it's harder for them to get. These are all moments. Every grocery store that we finance in our food desert, these are all moments that take us further along the road to our economic opportunity. But to truly close these gaps, we need a lot more. We need scale, resolve, perseverance to create many, many more of these movements, like these entrepreneurs shown in these images, to forge these many moments into a movement like the one that was displayed on the road from Selma to Montgomery. So thank you. I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Bill, thanks so much. And next up will be Leonette Anderson from Higher Purpose Co.
Thank you, Steve. I'm just going to jump right in. Higher Purpose Co. is a 501c3 economic justice nonprofit. We were founded in 2016 by our CEO, Tim Lampkin, and our COO, Ryan Gibson. And our mission is to build community wealth with Black residents in Mississippi by supporting the ownership of financial, cultural, and political power. And so what sits at the helm of this is asset building, narrative change, and advocacy. The team focuses on solution-based organizing to unapologetically tackle generational poverty, structured inequality, institutionalized racism. And some of the ways we're rethinking economic development and being more intentional about economic justice is through our key programming and through our recent building purchase that will house our Higher Purpose headquarters, Regional Community Wealth Hub. And before I dive into our work, for me, it is important to emphasize the most critical piece to our work. And it is a valuable component when we talk about structural change in this work and in the nonprofit world. And that is our team. The entire team is from the Mississippi Delta. We are Black and we reflect the community we serve. We understand that the answers lie within the community, and we are aware of the racial wealth gap, especially when data shows us that by 2053, Black household wealth is projected to be 0 in this country. So because of this, our work is mostly informed by root causes and not necessarily systems and systemic change. Next slide, please. And so this is why business ownership is a key program area affiliated with our asset building. One of our key initiatives is our business fellowship program. It is a 6-month fellowship program that includes a culturally relevant curriculum, a comprehensive business support, and prioritized access to our funding network. Our fellows meet 6 times throughout these 6 months with 3 local meetings and 3 weekend immersions. And they receive a business stipend, they connect with industry resources, and they join a community of entrepreneurs. Our definition of Black entrepreneurs is inclusive of worker owners, farmers, artists, and creatives, and residents who identify as women, rural residents, millennials, and returning citizens. Our priority areas include food and agricultural, health and wellness, education, and arts and culture. So since 2016, we provided entrepreneurship and community education to over 700 residents. We've assisted in the creation and expansion of about 15 businesses and provided business support to over 50 Black entrepreneurs across Mississippi, and majority of those entrepreneurs identify as Black women. So for the last 4 years, we've been hosting our annual Money, Purpose, Success Women Entrepreneurship Summit. And last year, we welcomed over 150 women from 6 surrounding states. And we're excited because this is our 5th year for the Money, Purpose, Success Summit that will be held in Jackson, Mississippi. And the goal of the summit is to provide Black women with the tools and resources they need to launch and elevate their businesses to the next level. And in addition to our education and training components we offer, it was important for us that access to capital was also a part of our work. Our second key initiative under asset building is our Higher Purpose Funding Network that was launched in 2019 and provides capital matchmaking, application packaging, and business growth support. So the funding network is streaming the capital application process for Black entrepreneurs. Our goal is to serve as a liaison between the entrepreneurs and our 9 partnering financial institutions. So we're striving to mitigate the systemic behavior that is traditionally associated with the lending process for Black entrepreneurs. The capital associated with the funding network is non-extractive, so we're focusing on excluding personal property from collateral requirements, low interest rates, reduced closing costs, creative repayment options, and our forms of capital for the funding network include business growth grants, IDAs, individual development accounts, lines of credits, unsecured and secured loans, and our Kiva loan. We're excited because we will be the first Kiva hub in the state of Mississippi. We received $175,000 in grant support to establish this hub. So through Kiva, entrepreneurs will be able to access up to $10,000 of capital with a 0% interest rate. So we consider the funding network a part of the pipeline to ownership. And so as we continue to cultivate a culture of entrepreneurship and ownership, we thought it was important that ownership showed up in our work. Next slide, please. So in November of 2019, we purchased a 13,000 square foot building, and that will serve as the Higher Purpose Headquarters Regional Community Wealth Hub. It's located in downtown Clarksdale, Mississippi, and it will serve as a multi-purpose theater, a food hall and marketplace, a co-working space, a creative learning lab, business offices, community event space, and a museum and gift shop. So our team continues to be excited about the work and moving the economic justice meter in the right direction. So every day we're dedicated to rethinking and recreating what this work looks like for entrepreneurs, Mississippi residents, communities to build community wealth. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll wait for everyone to join us here. And then I'll be asking a few guide questions, and then we'll open up to all of your questions. So please keep them coming. There's the question box in your GoToWebinar panel, and we'll try to get to those by like 5 after the hour so that we have about 20-25 minutes for your questions. But I'll start with, gee, there's so many questions, but what are some of the leading let's start with strengths, and what are some of the leading examples that you would want to point to of successful economic and community building in the regions where you work? Oh, that's Bill.
I'll jump in.
Okay.
There's just so many.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, we touch 100,000 people in some of the poorest communities in this country every day through our credit union branches. And they've all shown that when they have the tools that so many people take for granted, they can do anything that anyone else can do. But unfortunately, those tools are disproportionately not available. I think about a community like Morehead, Mississippi. We took over a bank branch there. It was the only bank branch in town that had closed. And the mayor took me outside of the city to take me to a community called Eastmore. This was a community where the housing development was built with rental subsidies back in the 70s against the wishes of the community because it was outside the city limits intentionally so that the black residents couldn't vote for the mayor. So black community for black people built to press the vote of black residents. And you drove there and you saw the community, the development had been built with shoddy construction, poor electrical, sewage in the streets. And the mayor said, if we can do something here, it would make a big difference. And so the first thing we did was talk to the residents. And the people living there didn't say, I need to close the hole in my roof. They said, we need a place where the kids can play and feel like they've got a bright future. We need sidewalks where the elderly could walk without falling through the cracks. And so we were able to pool resources that unfortunately the mayor didn't have access to because the local entities that are supposed to help black mayors, black communities, weren't as readily available to this community. But we were able to bring resources. We've redeveloped the housing in that neighborhood. The residents have created a strategic plan, and they identified things that would most help them climb up the ladder. Again, things that we all know: housing. We need better housing. We need jobs. We need small businesses to get capital to support their needs. They need a grocery store that sells more than junk food. And those are things that community development financial institutions can do if they are intentional about focusing on those communities. But we couldn't do it if the people there weren't empowered to tell us what they do. That's why cooperatives are so important. You need to put the control in the hands of the residents. And when people have a stake in the game, they'll tell you what they need. They know better than I do what they need. And they also will go to their local officials and they'll go to the town council meeting when they have a stake in the game. When they have a banking account, they vote more. When they're homeowners, they take this seriously. I think we see better results when we put the power in the hands of the people.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, I want to add on, Bill. I couldn't agree with you more. I want to add on to what Bill said, and Leonette pointed out the 13,000 square foot building in Clarksdale, Mississippi. Bill talked about the Hope Federal Credit Union growing and going into Montgomery, Alabama. But at the end of the day, what all this spells out and what the Federation is a shining example of is three things. You're talking about organization, where folks own their organizations. You're talking about infrastructure, where people own their infrastructure. And the bottom line of all of it is ownership. When you have ownership in a community, everything else springs from there. And the reason that the Federation has been so important to me and to many others, that it's owned by the community. And it's 13,000 acres that we as an organization, that a community can point to, that it is owned for 50 years. And that has sprung up everything else that popped from there. Because at the end of the day, for a community to be successful, it has to have its own economic base. And cooperatives, land, credit unions, the building that Leonette pointed to, those things are bases of their infrastructure, their bases of wealth creation. And those are things that take our communities further. And I think those are the success points that you asked about, Steve.
Great. Lena?
Yes, and Steve, I just want to add to that. I think that when, we have Cornelius on the phone and Bill on the phone, and then the higher purpose actually, starting off in 2016, we really look at some of the bases around the work. Like when you think about entrepreneurs, people ask, well, why farmers? And so, this was important to include farmers and educating people on cooperatives, but also, so we have the education component, but it was important for us to build this pipeline to the actual capital for them to have capital access. So all of it is important, especially around the pipeline and piece. And again, just getting to that place of ownership and financial power and cultural power and political power around it.
Great, thanks. So I wanted to ask, I think this question, I think mostly to Cornelius and Bill. I mean, both the Federation and Hope really have become institutions, right? And there's like a Federation's been around 50 plus years, Hope maybe 25 or so, right? And you know, how does that make you think about timeline and you know we want successes now for sure, and you know, it's as Shirley pointed out in the interview, it's a long struggle. So how do you think about that?
Well, Bill, if you don't mind, that's actually one of the key challenges for doing this kind of work. Because when you start looking at funding sources and people who come in partners, people want immediate success. People want you to show outcomes in 1, 2, and sometimes 3 years. But as you notice, Steve, this is a long road. And when you're starting to talk about people who have historically been discriminated against, and there's so much inequality, there's so much things you have to do and so much time it takes to get people to ground zero first. Then you start building from there. And so when you invest in communities, you have to take the long haul and see, you have to look at more than just one aspect of people's lives. You have to look at more than one aspect of the community. You have to connect it all. But more importantly, you have to build people to the point and be with them in that process while they're building themselves to the point where not only do they start owning things, but they start understanding the significance of it. And Bill pointed out, it's a springboard to all those other things. When people start owning their own institutions, when they start owning their own organizations, own bank accounts, they then start getting they start building their own capacity to run for offices and do other leadership positions in the community. So all of it is connected, but it's not a one-on and one-off. It's a long-term process, and that's the challenge of getting partners and other folks who are investing in this work to understand it and know that those results that they're looking for are not always going to be immediate.
Right. Thanks.
I mean, you think about the disparities in wealth in the Deep South, in the Delta, in the Black Belt, in inner city communities, and you look at where you've got $41 per capita philanthropic giving in the Delta, in the Black Belt, compared to $450 per capita U.S. overall, $4,000 per person in the Bay Area, in $2,000, $29,000, $30,000 per person in New York, $4,000 versus $40. You know, we kind of get what we invest in or don't invest in. Really, you know, we wouldn't be where we are but for philanthropy, but it's very, very sparse. And even and on top of that, organizations led by people of color are significantly under-resourced compared to our peers. We need all of us. We need Black and white-led organizations, but disproportionately, Black businesses are going to employ people of color at higher levels. People from African-American communities or Latino communities or the community where they do work are going to be more plugged in to the needs of those communities, and the resources are going to be directed in a more impactful way. And so we really need to change the narrative that there is not capacity in the Deep South, in communities of color. Lynette and Tim Lampkin are great examples of what can happen when people have the opportunity. And gosh knows they haven't been adequately resourced, but there's no one who shows more promise in terms of driving capital to small businesses in the Mississippi Delta than what Higher Purpose is doing. But as long as we buy into the narrative that there's no capacity and the resources don't go where it can make the greatest impact, I think we're not going to get the results that we all want.
Great, thanks. And Lynette, maybe I'll lead that to you. Like, you know, when you think about like the work you guys are doing in some of the businesses that you're working with, like the Youngs or other folks, you know, can you share a couple of those success stories?
Yes, so we work with the Youngs. The Youngs have been married for 55 years and they are farmers here. They came back to the Mississippi Delta and purchased land off of what we call Route 322. And so we are actually really looking at working with farmers as well because we're really trying to get farmers to look at farming also as a business. So you have the land, Ms. Young actually grows grapes for wine, and so she's actually a winemaker. And so what does that look like? What does that land look like, and building an actual place on their land for people to come out to have wine tastings, and just moving that plan around what they actually have into a business plan and to make money, but also really connecting them to other people in the community and other business fellows that we have. I now go out there and purchase food now. Unfortunately, Clarksdale we lost another Kroger. So really just trying to utilize the resources, connect people in so many different ways and in the right way for the community.
Great, thanks. So I wanted to ask too about policy, and I know we're at a time, when especially federally, you're often acting defensively, but given the current situation, what would you say are some of the most important policy issues that those who care about community economic development in the Black Belt need to be paying attention to?
I'd say if any community development organization is serious about inclusion, is not commenting on the proposed CRA rules, then you're making a deadly mistake. The proposed rules will gut CRA and really make it more is an existential threat to community development. By relying on a single metric that incents banks to do one large deal and check the box, you only have to meet 50% thresholds. There are so many problems in the proposed rules, and it's clear that there's an assault on regulations that were long-standing doctrine that we thought was settled. We're seeing so many things we thought would take care of 50 years ago creeping up again and threatening these communities, and CRA is certainly one of them. And I think fair housing, the fair housing rules, disparate impact rules are also very troubling. When you see in Mississippi a Black person who with a $150,000 income is more likely to be turned down than a white person who makes less than $50,000. You shouldn't have to find a smoking gun to challenge whether there's discriminatory practices, but the challenges of the disparate impact rules and fair housing laws will make that go away and make it harder to challenge lenders on discriminatory practices. And so there are some things that we should all be paying close attention to and making sure our legislators know are not acceptable.
And Bill, just a quick follow-up. Is there a date that people need to keep in mind for the Community Investment Act comment period?
It was March 9th, I think. It may have been extended slightly, but I don't think we should not wait. It's a critically important issue that we should pay attention to immediately.
Yeah, well, that's only like 2 weeks away, a little bit more. So, yeah. Cornelius, anything you want to call attention to?
Yeah, no doubt. So first of all, just from a general perspective, the three things that affect our work and affect most people in this country. First, on the federal level, the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is the second largest piece of legislation in terms of resources in this country, next only to defense. It's the only bill that touches every single person in this country's life, whether it be energy, food, conservation, or whatever the case, the Farm Bill. And it's a bill that we as a Black community benefit from the least, and primarily because there's a lack of understanding around it. And so really paying attention to the Farm Bill and the resources allocated in the Farm Bill to make sure they're adequately allocated, and to make sure that we access them. Because again, the Farm Bill is extremely important. That's on the federal level. Moving down to a state level, what we all talked about here was ownership. We talked about cooperatives, credit unions, etc. But in the South, in the Black Belt, where we're talking about, you have the worst cooperative laws in the country. Our laws are not very comprehensive. They are not good cooperative laws, and because of that, many organizations, many people who try to form cooperatives end up forming nonprofits. And not that there's anything wrong with a nonprofit, but it's a different vehicle than a cooperative as it relates to asset building, as it relates to wealth creation, as it relates to ownership. If a nonprofit dissolves, the assets, the resources are redistributed to other nonprofits. Cooperative, the assets are redistributed back to the community, back to the owners, and the owners own and control it. So the cooperative laws. Last but not least, we talked about land, and land is the biggest basis of wealth for the African American community by far than any other. But land is threatened primarily by one thing called heirs property. Many folks don't have wills or an estate plan in our community, and a lot of that's cultural. And because they don't have access to many of the resources like the Farm Bill and others because they don't have a clear title. And co-op laws and heirs property laws are creatures of the states. And the state has been historically known as that map that Bill put up there. That's where the largest slave-holding states were. That's where the largest amount of poverty is in this country, and that's where the worst laws are. And if it relates to heirs property, you have these laws of the states that don't allow people sometimes to clear their title very easily, and it makes it easy for folks to prey and have predatory practices that force folks to lose land. So we're losing a huge base. And again, my last slide I showed was land ownership at the rate we were losing land. And heirs property is one of the #1 reasons why we do that, along with others. But some of the laws, some of the legislation can help with a lot of that.
Great, thanks. Lynette, anything you want to throw in?
Yeah, certainly. I'll add to that, and it's the actual community block grant. So this is where cities and counties can and nonprofits can apply for government funding, but in certain states, it's only cities or counties can apply for it versus the nonprofit. So for us, specifically for the state of Mississippi, really trying to move that to where nonprofits are also able to apply and not just city and counties, and opening that funding up for a lot of nonprofits.
Great, thanks. And
Steve, can I throw one more
yeah,
item
sure.
in? Just two more. Consumer protection. The Consumer Finance Protection Bureau is really has been gutted under this administration. Ability to pay rules, protections against payday lending that really allow the most vulnerable on society to be preyed upon by loan sharks and other scam artists. Many of them who are, quite frankly, have either are paying for legislators and members of Congress to vote their way, and it's really something that needs to be changed. The billions of dollars in fees have been levied against people whose business practice were built on the basis of predatory abusive practices under the previous administration. Those protections are being taken away as we speak, and so all the work that we're doing, that the Federation has done for 50 years, that Hope and Higher Purpose are doing, is a drop in the bucket if we don't stop those predatory practices.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Bill. Cornelius, just a quick follow-up on the Farm Bill. Do you know when that's in the cycle or when people need to be mobilizing for that?
Yeah. So the Farm Bill is negotiated or discussed every 7 years. A new Farm Bill is passed every 7 years. Most recent one was 2018. So I guess we'll be gearing up in the next 6-7 years. Again, 5 to 7 years generally. So we work on it after one Farm Bill is passed. We start the next day. So it's something that you look at constantly and work on, but they're talked about, discussed, and passed every 5 to 7 years.
Got it. Thanks. So, Bill, you talked a little bit about the sort of vast gap in philanthropy. So that, you know, sort of the easy thing is that, not easy, but, you know, clearly there needs to be a rebalancing of philanthropy and more investment in the South, right? But it's also a question of, you know, how, there are probably good ways that philanthropy could intervene in some very bad ways. So, you know, what are some areas where, specifically where philanthropy could invest in a way that would, you know, boost your work and build the ecosystem as a whole?
Yeah, I think you should look at great examples like the Mary Reynolds Babcock Foundation. You know, they're a small foundation, but I really appreciate the way the groups like them and Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation, instead of parachuting in with their theories of change and their models, they actually talk to people in the communities. They talk to, they take the time to travel and learn the needs, and then ask how they can help. It may not fit their model, but rather than impose a strategy that may be great in Manhattan, but it's just a very different reality in Selma. And so I think foundations should first do what I think we do before we impose ourselves on the community. What is it that would be most helpful, and then direct resources in a way that addresses those needs.
Right. Cornelius, do you want to jump in at all? Yeah.
I do, and I'm glad you asked that question. My response is barbecue chicken, cabbage, and rice. And I say that because that's my favorite meal. But I say that because it's an example of what's wrong with the South. Barbecue chicken, cabbage, and rice, again, is my favorite meal. But look, when you break down chicken, it's the number one export of this country. The top 5 producers of chicken are in the South. That map that you showed.
Mm-hmm.
Cabbage. 3 out of the top 5 producers of cabbage in the South. Rice. 4 out of the top 5 producers in the South. That's the number 3 export in this world. So you got products being the number 1, number 3 export products in the world, and the top 5 producers, all 5 in chicken, 3 of the 5 in cabbage, 4 out of the 5 in rice. Yet and still, the South is the poorest region in this country. And what does that say to you? That means the infrastructure is not owned by the South. And so when we start talking about investing, we must invest in infrastructure. And we must invest in infrastructure that's owned by the community. When you start doing that, you will start seeing the difference. I think our system, our economy is set up for exploitation because the people who are producing, the people who are benefiting are not, the people who are owning it are not the ones who are benefiting. And so I think look at barbecue chicken, cabbage, and rice and invest around it. We must own the barbecue chicken, the cabbage, and rice in our community.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, and I'll jump in and say, Steve, not only, yes, definitely own the barbecue chicken and rice, but to Cornelius' points and Bill's point, on the barbecue chicken and rice, also bring people in conversation around the barbecue chicken and rice, to have that conversation, to have more trust-based conversations with the people that you're working with the philanthropic world. Because what happened really is, historically, we had just regular traditional philanthropy, and then in 2006 we moved into this like venture philanthropy where, unfortunately, philanthropists wanted to be a part of the work and fund the work, but they also wanted to say how that work was going to look. And so it was like they were not experts in the field, but they were actually guiding how that work looks. So as we again look at that and then move away from that, and we go more into these trust-based conversations that Bill were talking about, so people can be have these conversations to be proximate to the problem, to have the conversations with people in community. That's another way when we talk about the philanthropic world and being a part of this work and what it looks like, and how we build together and move into another direction.
Great. So I think I want to ask a question about startups, and then I want to move to audience questions. But Bill, I can't not ask you about the credit union. So you have to tell that story at least a little bit. You know, because you had Hope Enterprise and you started up the credit union at the church. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it's a necessity drives invention, and when I moved to Mississippi from North Carolina, I worked in credit unions in North Carolina, minority credit union, self-help credit union, and I shared some of that with the pastor during an orientation session, and he shared that he had been trying to start a credit union, you know, for a long time, and that would be my ministry at the church. And so my day job was a loan fund, but I was excited to have the opportunity to develop a tool that I'd seen, and quite frankly, it benefited me. My first account, I remember my grandmother taking me to the credit union in the garage of the vice principal, because it was the only place in the little town where Black folks could get access to credit. And so there was nothing in the neighborhood around the church except payday lenders and pawn shops and check cashers. And so, you know, pastor would stop the service every Sunday morning. People would join the credit union. Before we know it, we had a first charter of a credit union that had been made available in Mississippi in 8 years. Took another 20-something years to charter another credit union. We didn't realize how valuable that was, but we were able to help a lot of people around the neighborhood. But volunteers could only take us so far. And my day job, we saw a lot more demand for business financing in the Delta than the $1.5 million that we had for a loan fund. And so we knit the two together. Now the credit union is our primary source of liquidity. It's grown from the neighborhood in Jackson to now we're working across 5 states. But it's really been great to see, again, a model that puts people in a position to pool their resources to help their neighbors get so much traction. And again, it's exciting that it's owned by the people in the community, people of color, and women.
Great, thanks. Leonette, I mean, you guys work with startups all the time. Any particular one you want to lift up?
Again, you know, we talked about the youngs, but there are so many. We just had our fellowship, first cohort fellowship come through, and we work with another wife and husband couple, Theodore and his wife, and they're starting Sweet Tooth Teddy. And so they started out of, you know, their homes. And so they literally started from, you know, the paperwork process and what that looks like. And so we're just moving them, and we're actually having a pop-up shop, and they're actually about to purchase a new home and then look at what it looks like for a brick and mortar piece for them. So it's little success stories like that where, you know, Theodore was very adamant about, you know, getting out of his second job and what does ownership look like for him, and taking a hold of that, and just really needing just the tools and resources and just to get started. He also, again, a part of the fellowship, they get $1,000 stipend, so that went towards a lot of his startup. But then also at the end, we do a business pitch competition, and they won $3,500 again to launch and move some more. So we're really excited about that. Looking forward to, I think they're applied to be a part of the funding network, and just really pushing them on and cheering them along the way.
Great, thanks. Let me go to audience questions. So one, this one I think is for you, Cornelius, but I think there was a figure about, at least somebody heard the figure 18,000 Black farmers in 1992 or something like that. Do we have a sense as to what the number is today?
It was 218,000 Black farmers in 1910, and roughly around 18,000 in 1992. And I think this is an opportunity to talk about the census and the importance of the census, because there's always been a challenge to be counted, and we don't realize how important the census is because it dictates resources and everything else. But that's the challenge a lot of times counting. Right now, they're saying there's roughly about 30,000 farmers, but again, the count is a lot different than it was in 1910 and 1992, because there's so many urban communities that are starting to do urban farming and et cetera, which is a great thing. but it skews the numbers, and sometimes folks don't realize that the problem still exists and that we're still losing farmers, and farmers are aging out. But the number they use today, there's roughly around 33,000 or something like that.
Great, thanks. So maybe not surprising, we got a couple questions about opportunity zone investments, and I guess the question is, I'm sorry, is there any positive stories that have come out of that? We've heard a lot about opportunity zones being used, more for gentrification than for development, but are there any good stories that are coming out?
I think the jury's out. I think there are a lot of legitimate concerns about who will benefit from opportunity zones. Almost most of the Deep South probably qualifies, but the question is, are the investors who benefit from capital gains going to go into Clarksdale, into Selma, into Itta, Bena, and are those the investments that are needed to transform those communities? Are they going to be attractive enough to the folks who can afford to benefit from capital gains? We've created an Opportunity Zone Fund. We're using it for affordable housing. We're really excited about what we're seeing, matching that with low-income housing tax credit, 4% credit. I think there's some possibilities there, but it depends on an investor whose primary motivation is not maximizing their financial returns. They're already getting the capital gains benefit, and so they don't feel like they need double-digit returns on top of that. So I think there are some things that can be done to balance the scales, to maybe put more emphasis on investments that benefit persistent poverty areas. There's trillions of dollars out there, but there are not trillions of dollars looking for a home in the Deep South, in the Black Belt, and in the Delta.
Got it, thanks. So there was definitely a comment from a participant about, excited to hear about Clarksdale and the Delta, and maybe talk a little bit about Itta, Bena. I mean, you had the chair of the Federal Reserve come to Itta, Bena, Mississippi. I know Higher Purpose was there. I know Hope was there. I don't know if you guys were there too at the Federation, but how big of a deal was that, and has anything come out of that?
I think it was a big deal. It was the first time a sitting chair of the Federal Reserve ever came to the Mississippi Delta, and I think he said the same thing that probably Federation's been saying for 50 years. We've been saying for 25. Higher Purpose has been saying that there are segments of the economy that are not benefiting from these record returns. This robust prosperity that we hear about, and that if we don't close the gaps, then we are shooting ourselves in the foot in a country that's becoming increasingly black and brown. I don't care which side of the aisle you're on, you're not going to have a productive workforce. You're not going to have people who are generating the income to buy your products. And so, and if someone doesn't have a banking account, then the ability of the Fed to use monetary policy to tap the brakes or accelerate the economy is limited if the majority of populations are outside the banking system looking in. So to have arguably the most influential economic voice on the planet in the poorest part of the nation making those points, I think they paid a lot more attention to it than when any of us have been saying it over the years. So it was helpful, and the conversation has continued. We hope to have a follow-up forum sometime this year where we're bringing the business community in. I think they have a great opportunity to be the adult in the room in this divisive political environment that we have. They know that their workforce are increasingly poor, black and brown people who need education, who need assets, who need to be productive. And so to the extent that they can help make that case and shape policies and practices that further close the gaps, I think that's critically important. I'm really glad to see the Business Roundtable has put out a statement on the purpose of a corporation economy that works for all Americans, not just a few. So I think there's some, outside of the public sector, there are some things that we can build on that hopefully amplify the conversation that we had with the Federal Reserve Chair in Itta Bena.
Great. Lynette, anything you want to jump in with?
We were definitely present. I think Tim, our CEO, was there. And so to Bill's point, there were a lot of connections made. There were a lot of conversations that started there that are continuing to happen. So we're excited about that and seeing where that moves, and again, having more conversations around the importance of ownership and how things need to move and shift in this work.
Great. So another question that came out was about predatory lending and really, you know, what is the state of usury legislation in the Deep South, and are there states that have actually enacted laws that restrain, you know, predatory lending? Could be models for other states in the South.
I mean, there are financial predators. You know, the conversation with Dr. Sherrod earlier, you know, the Pigford settlement, that was about Black farmers being preyed upon, their land being taken, opportunities being withheld from them for discriminatory ways. We have some of the highest rates of small dollar lending in the country across the Deep South, in Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana. Arkansas did put a cap on small dollar loans. There's a crack, though, where you see a lot of online lenders finding their way in, and so you still have high rates of payday lending taking place. And the legislators, the state legislators, I think, have been waiting for the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau to enact legislation, which it had been doing. We were poised to see the first ever federal legislation limiting payday lending before the administration's change, and those efforts have gone backwards. And so I'm not optimistic about what we'll see out of the CFPB, and hopefully the states will follow the lead of the business community, who know that we can't continue to undermine large segments of the population by putting them in a weak economic and financial position.
Great, thanks. Cornelius, did you want to jump in there? I wasn't quite sure. No?
No. I agree with what Bill said. And again, I want to build a bridge from predatory lending to also make sure we always consider and think about the lack of access to credit and capital also. Because many times, as Bill alluded to, it was shown with the largest lawsuit in this country, where farmers were being intentionally left out and being discriminated against when it came to capital to operate their businesses, their farm businesses, like Lynette called out, and which led to land loss. And so all those statistics that we talk about, many times it's based on that predatory lending, but it's also based on the lack of access to credit and capital. And so that's a bridge from between the two.
Great, thanks.
And also related to that, there's again this narrative that there's not capacity in these communities to address those gaps. Well, capacity is there, is inadequately resourced. You know, if we invest in the Federation, invest in our purpose, and hope, you know, we're already doing things in communities that others are not, are neglecting. And so it's not, they say that, well, the reason that we allow payday lending is nobody else is filling that role. Well, you know, we had heard the same arguments about tobacco. You know, you let people kill themselves just because you can. No, we need to do, we know better, so we should do better.
Right. So I think I'll ask one last question, and of course I'll make it two-part just to be complicated about it. But you know, if you were to pick a single challenge in your work, what would you say is the largest challenge? And then maybe say something about, you know, how you try to use partnerships to address that challenge.
I'll start, and again, I think a lot of it there goes back to policy for me, because again, by definition, policy is the distribution and or redistribution of resources. And many times our communities, the Black Belt, that region that was pointed out, has the least amount of resources allocated for various reasons. And so making sure that we're engaged, actively engaged in policy, in advocacy, knowing where those resources are and making sure that we're fighting to make sure they're equitably distributed, and building partnerships among ourselves there is important, because in order to make a dent, we're up against these large corporations, these are lobbyists. We have to combine forces. We have to partner to talk about those things and make sure that resources are allocated equitably throughout the southern region, throughout the Black Belt, and in our communities.
Great, thanks. Leonette, do you want to jump in now?
Yeah, I'll say for us, one of our largest challenges has been just being a grassroots organization, being minority led, was really around the funding to really build capacity. It's one thing to have the funds for just programmatic work, but it's also another to have money not just for the deliverable outcomes, but for the transformation change. So what partnerships has really brought about from us. So when we partnership with Hope and Federation, and for them to include us in their narrative and change the story and to speak on our behalf, it's really pushed us in the right direction as we begin to talk to people across the nation, in California and other places, about our work, to really invest in the work here in the Mississippi Delta, and then to bring other people in the community on board with what we're doing.
Great. And Bill, I think I'll give you the last word here.
I wish we could put every member of Congress on a bus and take them across the Black Belt into the Delta and let them spend time with people and see not just the conditions. I think that's important for them to see what Bobby Kennedy shined the light on, and when he came, that there are places in the United States where the poverty is as terrible as it is in any developing country. I think people need to see that, but they also need to see the capacity, the potential of these people. They are, these are people who care about their communities. They love this country. They just do not have the opportunities that so many people take for granted. And when they see those gaps, hopefully we'll see better decisions, better policies. None of us can do this alone. We need to direct more investment into organizations on the ground that are doing what we do as nonprofits and locally rooted organizations. But we also need policies. We need banks. We need philanthropy, all working together. The private, the social sector, the banking sector, and public sector. And I think I think we have to be optimists in this work. It's hard work. It makes us frustrated often, but we wouldn't be doing it if we didn't think that there is a brighter future if we make the smart investments and we do the right things.
Great. So thanks. So we'll wrap up the webinar now. I want to thank our panelists, Leonette Henderson from Higher Purpose Co., Bill Bynum from Hope, Cornelius Blanding from Federation for Southern Cooperatives, of course, Dr. Shirley Sherrod from New Communities. Thanks to all of you for your questions and for joining us. And in the chat box, if you want to join us for the next webinar, or we'll go up north to Buffalo, New York, you can register now if you like. And please consider donating to Nonprofit Quarterly today. Thanks again to everyone so much.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you.